You've heard me talk about the brain and pain, but did you know that the brain can be trained to reverse all kinds of chronic conditions like chronic fatigue, long COVID, IBS, autoimmune conditions, sensitivities, and many other conditions too? This is Wellness by Design. I'm your host, Jane Hogan, the Wellness Engineer, and my guest today is Ashok Gupta, founder of the Gupta Program. It's a science-backed app that uses brain retraining techniques to reverse symptoms of chronic conditions like chronic fatigue and long COVID, IBS, and more. And in this episode of Wellness by Design, I talked to Ashok about his history with chronic fatigue, how he learned to use his brain to reverse the symptoms. We talk about a great analogy he uses to explain how the body creates chronic conditions and why retraining the brain is a solution. We also talk about the scientific studies that are behind the Gupta program. So stay tuned until the end because Ashok leads us through an amazing guided awareness experience that's preparing us to retrain the brain. You're going to love it. If you're new to Wellness by Design, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so happy you found us. And if you're a longtime listener or watcher, thank you too. I'm so grateful that you tune in each week to listen to what I'm sharing. And whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on your favorite podcast app, or maybe you're going to the wellnessengineer.com website, thank you so much. So please rate, review, leave a comment, let us know what you're thinking, give us a like, and subscribe to the Wellness by Design podcast. This helps this valuable information get out to more people who need it. And honestly, I feel like this makes the world a better place. All right, see you inside the episode. Well, hello, and I'm so excited today to have my friend Ashok Gupta as our guest on Wellness by Design, founder of the Gupta Program. And really, we're very aligned in the message that we talk about because it's the truth. It's the truth. We can use our brain. So I'm just so happy to have you here, Ashok.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Jane. Really excited to be with you here.
Well, we all come to this space, right, because of our own experience. And I know I'm saying for you, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be doing this kind of work?
Yes, well, as you say, many of us come to this because we've been through our own challenges, our own issues, and we've been able to conquer them and want to share that knowledge with others. So my journey started in the mid-90s when, a lot of these conditions weren't even recognized, chronic fatigue, what's that? It wasn't really seen as something serious and it was treated as just depression. And so I was studying at Cambridge University as my undergrad, and I suddenly had a virus, and I thought nothing of it. And the virus kind of went away, but my body just degraded and degraded. So it was severe exhaustion, and it was essentially chronic fatigue syndrome, or sometimes known as ME. And people ask me sometimes, well, what does that feel like? And I say, imagine your worst day of flu where you're in bed times 5. That's how it feels. Just absolutely zero energy, zero motivation. You just literally can't get out of bed. And in my worst moments, I had to crawl to the bathroom. I was just extremely exhausted. And I went from doctor to doctor, and they would say, we don't know what you've got. We don't really know what to call it. There's no diagnosis. There's no treatment. And you might have it for the rest of your life. And you can imagine for a young man.
Welcome to the rest of your life.
It's like a brick wall in front of you. And I'd met hundreds of others who were suffering. And I made a contract with the universe at that moment. And I said, if I can just get myself 30% better, 50% better, 80% better, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with this condition, because there are millions around the world suffering and not much medical attention being paid. And so I came across the work of Professor Joseph Ledoux and some of the brain neurology that he'd been reporting and studying. And it seemed to fit some pieces of the jigsaw together. And I also studied on my own physiology, and I came up with a hypothesis as to what might be causing these conditions. in an ad hoc way, retrain my brain and got 100% well, and then set up a clinic to treat others and published my medical hypothesis in 1999 online and in a journal, Medical Hypotheses, in 2002. And that was the start of this journey. And since then, we've published many more medical trials and now have an app and all these types of things. So yes, that's been my journey from my own experience right through to where we are now.
What a journey. And so what year was that you came across the using brain retraining as a way to change the physical body?
About 96, 97, around that kind of time, 98. So that's when I was studying this and retraining my brain and getting well. And we published our first brain retraining program in 2007.
Amazing. So you've been at this a while. It took me longer to discover the brain retraining because my background was rheumatoid arthritis. So I was kind of started going the whole paleo and doing all that first, which I know now created a lot of stress. All this whole, can't eat this food and feeling all this fear around food created a lot of stress. And that probably made me a bit worse actually for so you've had this this brain retraining, the Gupta program, since 2007. And what kind of results have you seen? So you've helped people with chronic fatigue. I know that you help other people as well. What kind of results have you seen, and what conditions have you treated?
Sure. So we call these conditions neuroimmune conditioned syndromes. Fancy title for the umbrella name for a lot of these conditions. And within there are different conditions that we seem to do very well with. So one is your typical neuroimmune condition. So that's your chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, long COVID. So we have a lot of long COVID patients, fibromyalgia. We know there's excess inflammation in those conditions and the pain that comes with that. And other types of chronic inflammation type diseases. Then another area is pain. So we treat a lot of people with fibromyalgia, unexplained pain syndromes, unexplained kind of neurological symptoms that seem to come and go. Then another area is sensitivity reactions. So that's mold illness, food sensitivities, chemical sensitivities, mast cell activation. And then finally, another area that we are very excited about are kind of autoimmune conditions. We anecdotally are hearing people recovering from MS and Alzheimer's, maybe not fully recovering, but certainly reversing some of the symptomatology. And that's another area that we want to investigate. So you can see a whole suite of different conditions that traditional medicine doesn't have particular luck with. And recently, in terms of our studies, we just published a clinical audit on 14 different conditions. And the Gupta program was shown to be highly effective across 14 different conditions, which are all very different. So mast cell activation, chronic fatigue, all these different illnesses. And that's also now garnered more interest in the medical profession that actually, yes, we have all these different branches of the tree, but maybe at the root, it's a similar cause for these illnesses. And a couple of other studies that I think are very noteworthy. We just did a study on fibromyalgia, and that was published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine, so a very prestigious journal. And we compared the Gupta program to a relaxation program equivalent. And after just 8 weeks, so 8 weeks is a very short period of time, we found that in the Gupta program group, there was a 40% reduction in fibromyalgia scores and 0% in the control group. We had a halving of anxiety, halving of depression, halving of pain, and a 50% increase in functional capacity just after 8 weeks. And of course, we're a 6-month program. And so that was a great study. And then we just published on long COVID about a couple of years ago. And that showed that compared to a wellness program, and that wellness program had diet, sleep, exercise, all the good stuff we prescribe to patients. So compared to a wellness program, the Gupta program was 4 times more effective at reducing fatigue and exhaustion and twice as effective at increasing levels of energy. And that's also a published study that people can read. And we're doing more studies now. So for us, it's about not just anecdotes, but really let's get the science behind this. Let's get the studies and finally prove this to the medical profession that, the work that I do, the work that you do, the work that other people do in this area, neuroplasticity, actually is the solution to these conditions versus trying to just throw more pills at people.
I love it because you and I know now that that is a cover up solution. Well, it's not even a solution. It's just masking things. It's not really getting at the root cause. And ultimately, people want their lives back without being dependent on these medications. And also, I think it's really empowering, right? Because you're putting the power back in the person to do the work, because ultimately the person has to do the work, right? Okay, Ashok, a lot of people might still be kind of new to the idea that the brain is responsible for physical outcomes in the body. So can you talk a little bit to that? I mean, I talk about it all the time. I'd love to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to always start with first principles. The biggest question of all, why are we here? I've seen some of this great question. I've seen some of the spiritual work that you do as well on consciousness, and I think we could have a lovely conversation at a philosophical level. Well, let's stick to the science for the moment. So how are we here? Why are we here? We're here because over millions of years of evolution, this brain, this body has evolved from plant life, single-celled organisms, invertebrates, vertebrates, reptiles, mammals, human beings. Our DNA contains that lineage. And I love this fact, 40% of our DNA is the same as a banana.
How is that crazy?
Isn't that crazy? So it shows you that we haven't just evolved as human beings, we've evolved for millions of years right from plant life. And therefore, this system is designed to adapt to our environment, survive, hopefully thrive, procreate, and pass on our genes to the next generation. So we are survival machines. And our brain cares more about survival than it does our wellness. That's the first jigsaw piece that kind of tells us more about it.
So key.
And the second, it's absolutely key. Yeah, absolutely. Survival is number one. And the brain, we might think of as this kind of thing sitting up here, and this is where we think. But actually, the brain is like the electrical system of the body. It's the information highway that tells the cells and the organs what to do, essentially. So it's like the master plan, the central processing unit, if you will, for the physical body. And the brain has been a black box until very recently. So medicine was very much focused on, well, we can measure this, we can measure that, let's fix this, let's fix that. The brain, but we don't really know much about the brain, so let's not really think about that too much. And that's how modern medicine and the way of treating people at a reductionist level has occurred. But actually, we believe the brain is involved and may even be at the root cause of so many different illnesses. I'm not saying it's in the mind, but in the brain, two very different things. And let's take an example. So, Jane, I don't know, are you a fan of Game of Thrones?
Well, yeah, I watched the first season, I think.
Well, if not, let's take fairy tales. Let's say a fairy tale. Okay. Let's imagine Queen Jane of your kingdom. That's a nice title. There's a nice ring to it. I think you'll like it.
I like it.
You are Queen Jane of your kingdom and your castle. And you have an army, which is your nervous system. And you have a navy, which is your immune system. And the army and navy defend the kingdom from invaders. So over the hill comes an invader. And your army and navy fight it off valiantly. And that invader can be a virus, can be a bacteria, can be a chemical, it can be mold, can be pain. Now, imagine in your kingdom there's a drought. So now the kingdom is weaker and your army and navy are weaker. And Jane, I'm sure you've seen in your practice as well that people who have these types of conditions, there tends to be in the preceding year to 6 months before they get the condition or a chronic condition, there's some chronic stress or pressure that has occurred or a build-up, accumulation of something.
Yeah.
So that's the idea of the drought in the kingdom. So now your army and navy are weaker than they are normally. Now another invader comes over the hill. Could be COVID, could be an infection, could be bacteria, could be mold. And once again, could be a pain injury. It's where you've just naturally just injured yourself in some way, localized. And that invader comes over the hill, but now your army and navy are really nervous because they know they're weak. So they have to work twice as hard to fight off that invader. And in doing so, they become traumatized. So they actually think, right, we're not sure if we fought it off fully because maybe now that virus is hiding in the bushes or hiding in the forest. That invader might still be around. So they come to your weekly meeting with Queen Jane and they say, Queen Jane, we now need all the resources of the kingdom. We need the wheat, the corn, the metal. We need everything. And you think, well, that makes sense. They've got to defend the kingdom because if they don't, the kingdom will fall. So now there's low energy in the kingdom because all the resources are going to the army and navy who keep fighting a battle they don't need to fight anymore. And in doing so, a lot of the arrows fall back into the kingdom. So that's the inflammation. We get chronic inflammation in the body because now the arrows that are flying over there are actually coming back into the kingdom. And then the Secret Service that normally get rid of spies. So this is your opportunistic infections, your opportunistic bacteria, other issues in the body, sensitivities. All those start flourishing in the body now. So now we have this dysbiosis in the gut as well. The whole system is imbalanced. We've got an immune system and nervous system over-responding, overstimulated, and we see that in the science behind long COVID and chronic fatigue. We then also have a body which is inflamed, a brain which is inflamed, that's hypersensitive and low energy and fatigued and dysbiosis, so the gut isn't responding correctly. And all of this then means illness, right? And what's the solution to this? Well, when those Army and Navy generals come to their weekly meeting with Queen Jane, you say to them, my dear generals, you have done a wonderful job in defending the kingdom, but the war is over. You can stand down. Yeah. And that's when they may not understand it the first time or the second time, but through repetition, this is where neuroplasticity comes in, repetition, we start forming new neuronal connections and letting go of old neuronal connections that were hyperprotective, training the brain that we aren't in danger and they can let go of that response so the whole body can come back to balance. And that's at the root cause. And with pain, it's a similar thing, which is that we know now that unless there's some obvious organic cause for your pain, you know, you've hit your leg, you've broken your leg, or there's an ongoing injury that keeps resurfacing. But actually 85% of cases of pain, there's no obvious organic cause. And once again, this analogy is similar, which is that the pain systems, the defensive pain systems, are now overworking, triggering and stimulating the nervous system, which is tightening all the muscles, causing inflammation, which then feeds back to the brain that there's pain and there's something wrong, which then causes that tightness, and round and round we go. So we have an emergency system in the brain, which is hyper responding. And if we can calm that emergency system down, as we know from lots of modern neurology on pain, then we can begin to heal the whole body. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the hypothesis and how the brain is involved.
I love that whole analogy of the kingdom. I think that can really help people understand what's going on there. So we've got all the nervous system and all this army working for us. Let's talk a little bit about the brain and how the neuroplasticity of the brain and why and how that can help us heal the body.
Yeah. Well, we talked about those Army and Navy generals. So we believe that the trauma, I don't mean trauma in the psychological sense, but those armies and navies who've become traumatized by war, we believe that's a brain structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala sits behind our eyes in the limbic system part of the brain. And those parts of the brain are designed to defend against threats. And traditionally, they've been associated with PTSD and trauma, but actually they also defend against physiological threats, biological threats, because the brain does not differentiate between the different aspects of our existence. Yeah, it just says, there's a threat to survival. What's the emotional, physiological, or immune response that's appropriate? And then the Army general it's the amygdala. The Navy general, the immune system, is in the insular part of the brain, which actually doesn't sit in the limbic system per se, but sits between the limbic system and the cortex. And a lot of recent research that we've done indicates that the insula is where the conditioning for the immune system lies. Now, what do we mean by conditioning? It means it's learned something new. So our nervous system has learned something new as a result of having this infection or whatever it is, or this pain. It's learned to hyper-respond. The immune system has learned to hyper-respond. We believe that's in the insular part of the brain. And so we see that the brain is causing a lot of these modern diseases, which are not diseases of something attacking us, but diseases of our own system hyper-defending and over-responding. And, you know, even if you look at a lot of skin disorders or eczema or asthma, these are all our own systems, unfortunately, erring on the side of caution and hyper-defending. And so in neurology, what they believe happens is that as we use this brain retraining, or as someone gets well, there's a reorganization of the brain, and the brain stops sending danger signals that we need to defend and begins to calm down. And what's really fascinating about the insula, I'm sure your audience will love this, they did some studies with rats, and what they found was they were able to trigger irritable bowel and certainly inflammatory bowel disease in the guts of these rats using an irritant. Yeah. And they measured this signature in the brain, specifically in the insula, of that immune response. And then they brought the rats back to baseline, and they triggered that same electrical signature in the insula. That's all they did. And the rats produced exactly the same inflammatory response in their guts.
Interesting. Wow.
Which is the first time in neuroscience we've been able to prove that the insula is where this conditioning lies, on learning what the immune system does. Because our immune system is so amazing and magnificent and wide-ranging, and it's so peripheral. But once it's defended against something, all of that great information and knowledge must be stored centrally, and it's in the brain. And that gives us the clue that then the brain may be the storehouse of wisdom, but also the storehouse of inappropriate responses. And that's why we believe the brain is central to these conditions.
That's amazing. I hadn't heard that about that part of the brain before, which makes a lot of sense for autoimmune conditions, right? That
Absolutely.
they continue on, and really how it manifests doesn't really matter. You know, rheumatoid arthritis really isn't much different when we're treating it than a skin condition, for example, right? So
exactly. So what we say is that the specific illness that someone will get will depend on the conditioning event, and what they call an ICE, initial sensitizing event. So your initial sensitizing event, if you were really stressed out and you exposed to mold, guess what? You're more prone to having mold illness. If you were stressed out and your system was completely depleted and then you had COVID, you may be more prone to getting long COVID. So the specific condition you get is based on what is the immune reaction to that illness. And if that's the point at which the learning occurs, then that's the symptom that you will end up with. Just like asthma, for instance. I mean, I'm not an expert on asthma, but once again, at what point in time did someone's respiratory system decide to hyper defend and respond against a threat? Yeah. And it could be we're seeing more and more children with asthma. And they know that increases when there's pollution, when someone grows up in an area with high pollution. So once again, could it be that their system detects the pollution at that point in time, suddenly decides this is dangerous, and then collapses the airways, essentially to reduce air intake? And so we can see that the threat that we have decides on the illness that we experience.
Mm-hmm. And what do you know, and how do you tie in, you know, obviously we have emotions are tied into this, and traumas and things like that. How do you address that aspect of it?
Yeah, so we are what we call trauma informed, in the sense that all of our practitioners and myself, we're trauma informed. We're aware of trauma, although we don't use our program specifically to treat trauma. But what we say and what we notice is that definitely with our patients, more than 50 to 60% have experienced moderate to severe trauma. Mm. And that primes our nervous system to get into this type of state. And let me explain why. Our nervous system is primed from even before we're born. So if our mother was stressed during gestation, then that impacts on our amygdala's factory setting. And then the birth experience itself. And then the first 5 years of life. Yeah, the birth experience, if it's very difficult, that can also impact on our anxiety and sensitivity levels. And then also the first 5 years of life. If we didn't feel nurtured or we felt neglected, that will impact on our amygdala's factory setting. And therefore, we're more sensitive to our environment because our brain has perceived more threats at a younger age. Yep. And of course, those threats may be biological, but they're often emotional, where a baby doesn't feel looked after. In previous generations, they were more physiological. Now they often tend to be emotional. And then, as we said, the brain doesn't differentiate between an emotional threat or a physiological threat or a biological threat. It's the same brain structures that are assessing threat. So we can see that if we're primed for emotional threats, we're also primed for physiological threats. So when we become an adult, we notice that people who have a background of whether it's mild neglect, right through to trauma with a small t, right through to trauma with a big T, anywhere on that scale, their brain then is more prone to learning these defensive responses. because it's more prone to dangers when they were younger. And that's how we explain why it is that people with adverse childhood experiences and more traumas in their past are more likely to get these types of illnesses.
It makes sense with that whole hypervigilance, right? And also when you're talking about the army, being aware of threats, whatever kind of threats they are, the army's going to be hypervigilant, which is going to weaken the rest of the kingdom, to use your analogy. Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so we are using the brain. We know that the brain is neuroplastic. In other words, it can learn new things. Can you give us a little sample, Ashok, of how an exercise someone could use to begin to retrain the brain?
Yeah. So I think the first port of call with any change work we find is awareness and acceptance. Yeah. It's so important. In fact, some would say it's not just the side dish or the starter, it's actually the main dish, as well. And for us to recognize that, it can be useful to recognize what we are resisting. So here's a little exercise that we can do if someone's experiencing some kind of symptoms, and those symptoms could be pain, or it could be agitation in the gut, or it could just be some symptoms of stress or anxiety that you feel in your physical body. Often we don't notice them. So this is just an awareness exercise. So what we can do, we can just get comfortable and we can close our eyes, and we can take a slow, deep breath in through the nose and breathe out slowly through the nose. Another slow, deep breath in. And breathing out through the nose. Now, keeping our eyes closed, let's become aware of the sensations in our body, such as any symptoms. These might be physical symptoms of tiredness or pain, or any sensations of the emotions we experience. So often when we experience an emotion, there is a physiological component. We often feel stress and anxiety in the chest and the stomach area. So just notice any sensations that you might be resisting in your body. And don't try to change them. Just observe them and notice them for the moment. And as you're noticing those sensations, notice your resistance to those sensations. Notice that little tension in your arms or legs. Perhaps there's a tension in your head, where you notice you're resisting. Feel that resistance. Take a slow, deep breath in. And breathe out slowly through the nose. Now imagine just consciously loosening that part of your body, wherever you noticed that tightness or tension. Keeping our eyes closed again. Let's notice and observe any resistance to what is so in our body right now. Observing it like a curious observer. And once again, if there's any resistance, tightness or tension, just notice it. Take a deep breath in with a smile. And breathe out slowly through the nose and just consciously loosen up that part of your body, breathing out the resistance. noticing the stillness of this present moment right now. I'm noticing any remaining resistance, if any. Imagine what it would feel like if you truly accepted what is going on in your body. It has already happened, whatever those sensations are. Anything we can do is accept instead of resist. So imagine what it would feel like to accept whatever is happening in your body right now. Let's take a slow, deep breath in. And breathing out slowly through the nose with a smile. Imagine what it would feel like to accept what is happening in your body. Enjoying the stillness of this present moment right now. Becoming aware that acceptance is the first step on the journey towards healing. Keeping our eyes closed, let's take a slow, energizing breath in. Breathing out with a smile in whatever way feels comfortable. Another powerful breath in. And let go when you're ready. And when you feel comfortable, when you feel complete, you can just gently open your eyes.
Oh, that was so nice. Take a little moment to just be still and accept that awareness. And I also really liked the way you talked about smiling on that exhale too, because smiles are powerful. They send messages to our brain, right?
Exactly. Fake it before you make it.
It does work.
Yes, absolutely. Your brain can't tell the difference between what's real and imagined. In neuroplasticity, we obviously take advantage of that concept to guide the brain towards the direction we want to head in.
Yeah. That's so good. And, people may think that brain retraining, is something that feels like a lot more than it is. I mean, that was so simple, right? And we were doing a little exercise where we're teaching our brain to notice the calm and to accept that we're fine as we are right now. Really beautiful.
And these are preparatory exercises. So we have 3 hours of the program. So the first hour is relaxing the nervous system. So we can't be relaxed if we're resisting what is going on in our body. So that's the first step. And the second step is then retraining the brain. And those techniques are very different. So they are a specific 7-step process to retrain the brain out of these repetitive patterns. And the third hour of the program is what we call re-engaging with joy. And what we talk about there is how to stay well, because people can get well, but how do you stay well? How do you make sure you keep a lid on your stress levels, your anxiety levels for the rest of your life? And that's where we do a lot of parts therapy and help people understand more about these different personalities which may be living within them that cause them stress and how to move through that with grace. And that helps a lot with past trauma as well.
Right.
It's really how to regulate our nervous system in the longer term.
I love that 3 parts to it. And And you mentioned parts. So is that sort of similar to internal family systems, that type of?
Exactly right. Yeah. So the founding father of that was obviously Dr. Richard Schwartz, and we have our own take and our own way of helping patients with that.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful integration. Okay, so that's the Gupta program. And you do have an app, as you mentioned. I've been on the app. It's really beautiful. And actually, I love that's your kind of your background right there, that very calming background and very well organized. So wonderful. So we will have a link to share that with people if they're interested in having a look at the program. But also, before I get there, I want to ask you one thing. So I always ask all of my guests, what's one thing that you would recommend that someone could do today, the baby step they could take today that's going to begin to initiate the healing in their body? What would you say?
Well, Jane, I have something really practical that people can join straight away. So in the Gupta program, we have something called daily Gupta size.
I love it.
What that is we recognize that people are isolated, especially if they have pain syndromes or they can't work, whatever it may be. And healing the community is so powerful. So every day, one of our trained coaches comes on Zoom, and these are nervous system regulation sessions where there's somatic work, breathing, and meditation. That's the first thing that I would encourage people to join. And guess what? It's absolutely free. So if people download the app, they go to the website, through the links you'll have, they can join Daily Gupta Size for free in terms of the nervous system regulation part. And that's the first step that I would encourage people to do. And some people heal just through that first step. Even though that's a preparatory step, it prepares our brain for neuroplasticity. It's a very vital step. And that I would encourage everyone to do. That, we can't rely on pills anymore. We have to recognize that it's our responsibility in this chaotic world that we live in to find that sanctuary of stillness and space. And if people say, oh, I tried to meditate, I tried to breathe, it doesn't work, what we find is that, first of all, we tailor our approach to specifically help people with anxious minds. But also, when you meditate with 200 or 300 people a day, it's cool, we have like a couple of hundred people there, something powerful happens, the power of collective intention. When you're meditating, you've all got that collective healing power. It helps you slip into that deeper state as well. And that's been so incredible for our patients.
Yeah, that's a magic of, sort of coherence and energy, right? We could get into a whole conversation about that, but we won't today. We'll keep it simple. It's beautiful. I love that. So is there anything that you want to make sure that the audience hears that you haven't said yet?
Yeah, what we'd love people to do is take our free trial, even if they don't want to pay for a premium program. There's so many free videos and audios and daily Gupta size, so they can actually get a lot of healing straight away through that. And we really encourage people to give this a go, because if they do take our full program, until we have large-scale phase 3 trials, we offer a 1-year money-back guarantee on our treatment, no questions asked. So people really have nothing to lose by, letting go of some of the old paradigms around treating pain and these types of neuroimmune conditions, and really going for it and saying, actually, here's a new way of healing. And I'm really excited about the future. I really hope that in 5-10 years' time, when you go to your doctor and you say, I'm suffering from this, the first thing that they prescribe is a wellness program of neuroplasticity and supplements, and something that actually has got the clinical evidence behind it. So that's my hope for the future.
I love that.
And really, the final thing is, I want to tell everyone, you can heal. No matter what you've been told by your doctor, by your support group, whatever, where they say, oh, these things are incurable. We see people healing every day, whether it's through our program or other approaches. So never give up hope. You can heal and get there.
Beautiful message of hope. And I love that you are empowering people, but also, as you talked about the future, that's empowering the physicians too. I know that they must feel so frustrated when they've got patients that don't heal, and they became doctors because they wanted to help people heal. So it's empowering on all sides. So I really, really love that. And I'm just so grateful to you being a guest today, Ashok, on Wellness by Design, and also for just this beautiful body of work and what you're sharing with the world and helping people change their lives and find more freedom again, because ultimately a world with less sick people is a better world, right? So
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for being our guest today. And I'd love to have you back sometime where maybe we'll dive into a little bit more of the spirituality side of things, which would be another fun conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jake.
And thank you to people watching, listening, and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because you could be changing their life too. All right, we'll see you again next week.